Well, welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Memphis. Keep in mind, the time, the mid-1950s, the place, Memphis, Tennessee, the location, Beale Street. Does this sound familiar? You just saw $1 Million Quartet. It's so ironic that two famous Broadway shows would be playing side by side that basically deal with the same phenomena, the birth of rock and roll. Both of them dealt with the theme in a very different way, and both of them have become landmark musicals. I have a very deep reverence for Memphis. It combines all the best of the old musicals with all of the best of the new musicals. It follows the sort of Oklahoma formula. It's a well-made story, beautifully told. You care deeply about the principal players. You move into a very strong sense of time and place, the world of race, romance, and rock and roll clearly come alive for you in this sassy musical Memphis. I want to do something that I've never really done before. I'm trying to trace for you the creative evolution of this show, and to show you how when a personality, when an artist comes into the mix, not only does he bring his own artistic vision to the work that he's about to present, but he brings his whole history. And very often, many of the artists who have worked on this show have come from interesting theaters, experimental theaters, from the world of rock and roll. They've come from different formats, and they each brought their own special expertise, and all of them put their stamp on this show. This show speaks for itself. It sings for itself. It dances for itself. It's an extraordinary event, and you all want to be on Beale Street in the mid-1950s, and certainly you are when you see this show. But let me go back to the beginning then and show you how a series of people would influence the creation of this show and what stamp they would put on this show so you can look for it as you see it. First of all, the idea for this show came from a man named George W. George. Now, that's a pretty interesting name. He was a very interesting offbeat producer. His father was Rube Goldberg, the great cartoonist. And Rube Goldberg, as you may remember, during the Second World War, his cartoons were so pertinent, so cutting edge, that very often he received death threats. So he said to his children, "You've got to change your name. You can't be a Goldberg." And so his son George took the name George W. George to protect himself from his father's both fame and infamy. But he was definitely a New York kid with sort of leftist leanings, sort of liberal leanings, and it is no surprise that George W. George would fall in love with the idea for making a musical about Memphis in the mid-1950s. Just for a moment, a quick background about George W. George. He was a Broadway producer. He did Any Wednesday and Dylan and a variety of other shows. His probably most famous film that he created was My Dinner with Andre. So he was a sort of, man about town, savvy, smart, feisty, sassy. And in his old age, he was reading in the late 1990s and going into the early millennium. He was reading about the early days of rock and roll, and he read a book about Dewey Phillips. Now, Dewey Phillips is immortalized in the show you see tonight. He's called Huey as the central character, but the real person that this show was based on is Dewey Phillips. So George W. George fell in love with this very eccentric man. Let me sort of set up the profile then for you about Dewey Phillips. Dewey Phillips was a disc jockey in Memphis, Tennessee. He was sort of a loser. He never could really hold together a job. His life was always in chaos. He liked to speak in kind of gibberish. He was a very offbeat, colorful character. He loved to wear plaids and stripes, and he was absolutely an outrageous eccentric. And he never could find his place. And finally, he so loved the music that was happening on Beale Street. So again, we remember Beale Street as that incredible street in Memphis that goes from the Mississippi River to East Street. It is only 1.8 miles long, but it would transform music literally everywhere in the world. In this period, in the late 40s and early 50s, Dewey Phillips would sneak down to Beale Street. It was definitely a segregated area. Only blacks went to Beale Street. But what happened there was a brilliant combination of black music. And it was gospel music, it was early rock and roll, it was early rhythm and blues, it was rockabilly. It was absolutely the most incredible sound that ultimately Dewey Phillips would introduce to the white world, and ultimately we would have a cultural revolution with the birth of rock and roll, and Elvis Presley would take that sound and make it a universal sound literally everywhere in the world. So Dewey Phillipson was this sort of eccentric, living in Memphis, almost always unemployed. Finally, he went to a near bankrupt radio station and said, please let me have a 15-minute slot. I would like to play this new music. Well, this was very controversial because at the time, black music was called race music. And, you know, it would play on black radio stations for a black audience, but it never played on a white radio station for a white audience. And so Dewey Phillips was given 15 minutes, and they put him on the air just as the black radio stations were going off. He named his show Red Hot and Blue, and he called him Daddy-O Dewey. And he was absolutely eccentric. He played these new sounds, these new black records, and he would speak over the records. So he was the first great shock jock in that he was appealing to both a black and white audience. Young people fell in love with him, and he developed an enormous following. Very quickly, within a very short period of time, his show lasted 3 hours and was the most listened to show in the South. But the major contribution he made was he was presenting race music, black music, to a white and black audience. They always talked about the idea of the middle of the radio dial, meaning that was definitely white. And suddenly, young black kids, young white kids were listening to Dewey Phillips. So this interested George W. George tremendously, and he thought that this personality would be a wonderful personality to bring to life. Keep in mind, in real life, Dewey Phillips had tremendous highs and then tremendous lows. After he had the great success with his radio program, he started a live television program that preceded American Bandstand, where he would have kids dance to the new rock and roll music, but he would use black and white artists on his live television show. It was also broadcast on the radio. So national networks got very interested in him long before Dick Clark came up with the idea of American Bandstand. But they went to him and said, we'd love to put you on national television, but you can only use white musicians and you can only have white kids on the air. I mean, it's so hard to even speak about this now. It's so unspeakable. But yet, that was the rule of the day. And Dewey Phillips, I can't tell you what he said. I mean, one of his great lines was, huckadoo, so that will have to do. I can't tell you the spew of obscenities that he uttered to the New York offers, but in any case, he refused to do that. And then his radio station started doing the top 40 hits, and therefore he was no longer pertinent. He had a very serious alcohol and amphetamine problem, and sadly he died at 42, basically unknown. And it hasn't been until the last 10 or 15 years that people have started writing about this period, being interested in this period again, to see who the real pioneers were in terms of developing and discovering this music. Keep in mind, it was Dewey Phillips who was the first disc jockey who interviewed Elvis Presley. And he was the one who helped present Elvis and his brilliant work. Those of you who remember Million Dollar Quartet remember that Sun Studios, the record studio that created those works, was owned by a man named Sam Phillips. They were unrelated, but these two men, Sam Phillips and then Dewey Phillips, would be the men who really would bring about this explosion of rock and roll. Okay, so it was George W. George who discovered the sort of lost life of Dewey Phillips and decided that this would be wonderful material, the right time, the right place, the segregated South, the struggling for civil rights, that all of these issues would be very pertinent and very provocative and could work very well in a musical. He was certainly right. And he then commissioned a young writer named Joe DiPietro. And Joe DiPietro had been a book writer for several off-Broadway shows. His biggest hit was I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. It was a divine off-Broadway musical that ran for 12 years. Only the Fantastics had a longer run off-Broadway. So Joe DiPietro was a wonderful storyteller, and he had a wonderful sense of making his lyrics really sing. So he would write the story and the lyrics for I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. So George W. George went to him and said, could you work out a storyline about Dewey Phillips? So Joe DiPietro very quickly did it. He's a brilliant playwright. A lot of his work has been done off-Broadway, and he's now sort of the flavor of the month. He has a new show just about to open in New York. Again, he won the Tony Award for Memphis, so he's really at the top of his career right now. But at this point, he was still struggling to be a preeminent book writer and lyricist for the Broadway musical. So he very quickly put together a storyline. He used 1950s Memphis, he used Beale Street, and he decided to take the character of Dewey Phillips and to use a great deal of it in the telling of the central character, who he names Huey in the musical that you see. So, but he borrows freely, and he borrows other ideas from other disc jockeys of the day. We remember in Cleveland, of course, we had Alan Freed, who was literally performing from this building that we're in tonight, and he was, considered in many ways also one of the fathers of rock and roll. So a lot of personalities from the disc jockeys of the day were combined together into this character, Huey, that you will see as the central character in the musical that you see tonight. And Joe DiPietro quickly put together a very powerful story that involved an interracial romance. It dealt very strongly with the time and place, and it made Beale Street really come alive. One of the things I want you to look for so carefully in this show, it's something we rarely talk about, is the power of the chorus. The chorus in this case adds tremendous dimension. It adds all of the atmosphere, all of the background, all of the sense of time and place, all beautifully orchestrated in the lyrics of the choral songs that are used in the show that are really gangbusters and numbers that would make you just jump out of your seat. They're so wonderfully conceived. So Joe DiPietro created the script that was based then on a real-life event dealing with the birth of rock and roll. He then went to his agent, and again, this is all part of a system that we don't get to talk about often. And he said to his agent, I really think that the music for this show should not be written by a standard Broadway composer. It should be written by a real rock and roll artist. So will you pass this script around in the world of rock and roll and in the world of the real composers in the world of rock and roll? Now keep in mind, we have a somewhat tradition of this. Elton John was a music icon that came outside of the musical theater. He gave us Billy Elliot, he gave us Aida. We had Green Day that gave us American Idiot. Even Dolly Parton used her music in a musical called 9 to 5. And most recently, Bono wrote the music for Spider-Man. So the idea of using music icons outside of the musical theater, there is a trend for this. And so it was put out into the world of rock and roll. And happily, one of the keyboard artists from Bon Jovi, his name is David Bryan, read the scenario for the outline and said, I love this. The music all sings to me. I know what to do with this whole script. Keep in mind what Joe DiPietro had done. He wrote a script suggesting songs, even titles of songs, who would sing them, how they would fall in the show, etc. And so when David Bryan read this, it was like reading a scenario for a composer to say, punch in a song here. And so he called and said, I'm enormously interested in working on this project with you. And so Joe DiPietro said, well, could you come up with a song for me? And the next day, Joe DiPietro received, by special delivery, a song called The Music of My Soul, which is one of the beautiful songs that's in the show. And it was very clear that David Bryan understood this time and place and understood this music. Keep in mind, Bon Jovi had played for over 20 years as a major rock and roll band. They had sold over 100 million records. So this is a man who very clearly understands rock music in a very sophisticated way. And while David Bryan has been very successful, when you hear the score, it really brings back the 50s so strongly. But the thing is, to really praise David Bryan, is his music is so much more sophisticated than the music of the 50s. He understands harmonies in a very special way, and his musical ear is very delicate and extraordinary. He's like a classical composer in his ability to blend sounds and voices in very interesting harmonies and unisons in the show. So especially listen to the choral track all through the show. I mean, the chorus is just in your face all the time. They are extraordinary. But try, aside from being overwhelmed by the power of the music, to listen to some of the levels that he's created in terms of harmonies, rhythms, etc., to really give the chorus great prominence and to bring to life this period of the 50s in a very, very powerful way. So this was a perfect coming together of two men. They worked brilliantly together. They subsequently created a work that's playing off Broadway called The Toxic Avengers. So they have two shows that they've collaborated on, and they're working on a new musical about the period from 1962 to 63, where all of the great songwriters worked in a building called the Brill Building in New York. And so it's called Chasing the Music. And it's about those artists, and that will be a Broadway show coming up in the next year or two. So these two men are really a powerful team. Not only were they both honored with Tony Awards for their outstanding work, but they clearly, when you see the show, you see how brilliantly the words and music blend together in the telling of the story. Okay, so this was a perfect union. They then decided to do a series of workshops, and they went to a theater in California in Silicon Valley called Theater Works, where they did a small workshop of the show. And this was in 2002. Keep in mind, the show didn't open in New York until 2010. So it was almost a decade of work in developing this process. The cast they put together for that sort of workshop in the Silicon Valley stayed together through the whole long 8 years of developing this project. And what happened was the cast got to know the material so well, even though it kept evolving and changing, that they were able to give these very dimensional and detailed performances that we will see in the show tonight. So the first workshop happened at a space called Theater Works, and it then went to Massachusetts North Shore Theater, where it had a full production. This was in 2003, and then it went back to Theater Works, where it also had a full production in 2004. Everything stopped on the show for 4 years. I couldn't find any real information to tell me why. After a lot of digging, I realized that there was a lot of litigation about the show, so perhaps the rights of using Dewey Phillips' life, or perhaps the fact that George W. George was at this point dying and was not able to really function as the producer of the show. He was a very old man by this point. The show went into a kind of limbo for 4 years, but everyone believed in the show so much that they kept in contact trying to develop the show. So what subsequently happened in 2008, the La Jolla Playhouse was interested in mounting a full production of the show, and this would transform the show. So in that 4-year hiatus, they found 2 new producers, who had spent their lives working at the Goodspeed Theater and working at Theater Works, both spaces that developed new shows. And so the end result was the producers, while they didn't have Broadway credits, you can read about them in the program, while they didn't have Broadway credits until Memphis, had 20 years of working in the theater. Goodspeed Theater, which is in East Haddam, Connecticut, has specialized in developing musicals, old musicals, new musicals, revivals of musicals for Broadway. They have sent 19 shows to Broadway, including Annie, including Shenandoah, including Man of La Mancha. So it's an amazing theater facility. So that producer was able to bring an enormous amount of savvy into shaping the show. And the same thing was true with Theater Works, the theater in Palo Alto. For 20 years, the producer there had worked with developing new shows and getting them ready for commercial venues. So they had tremendous expertise. And then also added to the fact, now we're at the La Jolla Playhouse. The year is 2008. The new artistic director of the La Jolla Playhouse is Christopher Ashley. We know Christopher Ashley as the director of All Shook Up, which was a musical about Elvis, and also Xanadu, both of those shows that played at Playhouse Square. He's a young, very interesting, cutting-edge director. He was just taking over his leadership of the La Jolla Playhouse, and the La Jolla Playhouse, of course, had produced brilliant shows like Jersey Boys and large numbers of major Broadway shows, The Who's Tommy. And so the end result was he was in very heavy competition, and he had to come up with really a gangbuster show. So he picked Memphis, and they staged it at the La Jolla Playhouse. He used his collaborator, who was the choreographer Sergio Trujillo. We have seen his work in Jersey Boys. You will see his work again in the Addams Family. He is at the forefront of choreography in New York right now. And ironically, Sergio Trujillo also had this very interesting background in 1950s rock and roll music. He did the London production, the stage version of Peggy Sue Got Married as a London musical. He did All Shook Up, the musical about Elvis Presley. So he certainly clearly understood the music of the time and the dance of the time. So this was a perfect combination of people to put together for the mounting of the show. It played at La Jolla Playhouse. It then moved to the Fifth Street Theater in Seattle, again another cutting-edge theater that develops new shows. In your travels around America, put some of these theaters on your list. They're certainly worth seeing. If you're traveling, just check with me and I'll tell you the best theater to look at in the area you're going to. But in any case, it played there, and then it moved directly to Broadway. Now keep in mind, it kept that cast that had worked all those years together. And so they had found this tremendous dimension in the way they played the role. The show went through a lot of transformations in the years that it was developed. And again, there is a book here in terms of showing you how important it is to find the right moment for the right song and the right person singing it. A couple of little backstage things I'd like to tell you about. Sergio Trujillo, the great choreographer, the major contribution he makes to all of his musicals is he always looks at the musical and tries to find ways of dancing it rather than saying it or singing it. And so he was enormously successful in this show. I can't remember a Broadway show that has a sassier, more compelling chorus. The choreography is extraordinary, and to me, the real star of the show is the chorus of this show. And it really is the work of Sergio Trujillo to bring the story to life, not only through the words of the music or through the storyline, but through the energy of the dance. Let me just point out one example for you that shows you the brilliance of Sergio Trujillo. There is a song in the show called Radio, and it's at the time that the character Huey, the demented disc jockey, is playing his music and trying to reach both black and white audiences. And in the process, we see the kids listening to the radio. And the scene that we see are kids jump roping. And in that simple little scene of jump roping, a dance about jump roping, you see all of the issues of race, rock and roll, all of the issues of the show come together so brilliantly in that touching and memorable little moment in the show. That's the kind of work that Sergio Trujillo brings to the show. So we have a group of artists then. Many of them have worked together in collaboration. Many of them worked together on All Shook Up. And so they have a history together of working well together, and the end result is they bring those qualities to make this vital show. There are a couple of things just as a final note that I'd like to remind you of. This show speaks to prejudice, and it speaks very powerfully to strong social issues. You know, it's so interesting. We keep dismissing the musical as simply being entertaining. But remember how many of our musicals have changed the way we think. I mean, you think about a musical like South Pacific and that song, You've Got to Be Taught, meaning you have to be taught prejudice. And then the countless numbers of shows, everything from The King and I all the way down to Rent and Hairspray, have dealt with issues of racial inequality and the power of it. And it's manifested so powerfully in this show, in the music, in the lyrics, in the choreography, in the separation of races. That wonderful opening scene where the disc jockey sort of stumbles into a bar in Beale Street, and he's the only white face there, and he's celebrating every moment of it because he's hearing a kind of music that's literally transforming his soul. Remember, the use of the chorus is a very ancient idea. I mean, going all the way back to the most ancient forms of theater, we had choral activity where people sang and danced and chanted the story. The Greeks, when they created their great tragedies 5 centuries BC, when Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides created the great tragedies, basically the story is told through the chorus, and the power of the chorus establishing the ethics, the time, the place, the philosophy, the values. And in this same way, watch that the literal show that you're seeing tonight, this sassy musical, literally does the same thing. The chorus is enormously powerful in articulating a tapestry that's so rich for you that you feel that you're in the 1950s and you're sensitive to those issues, those powerful issues of race that scarred our country so terribly. So watch for the chorus, not only in terms of the brilliance of the dancing and in the lyrical power of the singing and in the wonderful sophisticated orchestrations that are developed for the choral voices, but listen carefully to how they really function in the same way the great tragic choruses did in the period of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And even though this chorus basically is a kind of anonymous chorus, you take on a tremendous sense of identity. Each character is very carefully delineated for you so that you feel that you can relate to all of those people. There's a wonderful song in the show that's called Everyone Wants to Be Black on a Saturday Night, and it's a delightful song. And keep in mind how controversial that idea was, especially in the 1950s. And yet when you watch this show, your soul just stirs with this music, and you feel the sensitivity for it. There's a brilliant anthem song in this show about Memphis. It stands right up there with New York, New York, or San Francisco. And I hope Memphis has been smart enough to put it on all of their ads for tourism, because it's a brilliant song. And when you hear that song sung near the end of the second act, you immediately want to get in your car and drive directly to Beale Street. So you're in for a great treat tonight. It will be Saturday night for all of us in this extraordinary show. So enjoy Memphis.
And my mama, she cried and